Kia ora koutou. Welcome to our Friday Public Health Seminar. Can I, as a sort of health and safety note at the beginning, say that because the air conditioning isn't working, we recommend that you come further down where it's a bit cooler. So if anyone wants to use this opportunity to move down, then please do so. It's also nice to come down, be near the front. It's impossible to make anyone move, I know this. Some people don't. We expect it to get hotter and hotter at the top, so you know. So welcome and thank you for joining us today. I'm stepping in at the last second to chair, so my apologies for any misspeaking. So I have the pleasure, though, today of introducing Michael Fletcher, who comes to us from AUT in Auckland, where he's in the Department of Economics. Is that something you've got a more specific title of your department?
Management, actually.
Management.
Faculty of Management, Economics and Law.
And also Michael, as many of you will know, is also my uncle, so I'm stepping in a familial role as well, and not very, but he's going to talk to us today about the work that he's, and we've got other family members scattered through the audience. To be a distraction. So he's going to be talking to us today about some really important work that he did for his PhD, which he's just recently completed, and more than that, more than your PhD, yes?
No,
it is your PhD. Yeah.
I'll explain this.
Yeah. And we also have people joining us from afar, so we will ask that people use the microphone and things when we're asking questions. And so we have about half an hour of talking and then hopefully some time for some discussion afterwards. So I'll hand over to Michael.
Thank you, Ruth. Tēnā koutou katoa, and thank you for coming and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. I'm not actually going to be talking about my PhD. When this first came up was quite a few months ago, and the idea was then to talk about the previous government's welfare approach, so the social investment approach and the future fiscal liability stuff, and I was going to be fairly critical of it, and that now seems less relevant. So we talked about it a little while ago after the change of government, and I suggested that maybe I should talk about some of my ideas about priorities for longer term welfare reform. And so that's mainly what I'm going to talk to about. It does relate tangentially to the PhD, which was around the economic consequences of divorce and separation and the child support system, but it's primarily about welfare reform, and it's primarily about the longer term issues, or what I see as the longer term issues. People who know me, and there's a few of them here, probably wouldn't describe me as naturally an optimistic sort of a person. I'm the sort that can tell you precisely what proportion of the glass is empty, particularly if it's a wine glass. But even I got taken up with this enthusiasm with the change of government, and I honestly think that it is an opportunity, that it could well be a significant government that will make some significant changes, a government more like the 1972 Labour government than the 1984 one, I should say. And with that in mind, I was tempted to sort of steal from Dennis Glover and misquote and say, who knows what they yet may say in Morrinsville and Whangarei. But I crossed it out and I couldn't resist saying it after all. So, I'm going to do this wrongly, I know. That's what I'm going to cover broadly today. I've included under there a bit about where to for social investment, which I've actually dropped out. And if people would like to talk about that in question time, we can. But I've dropped it out for time reasons primarily. I want to start by talking a little bit about what the previous government did and didn't do. So what did it do? It renamed the benefits. It extended the work test to sole parents, first to those with youngest child over 5, and then to youngest child over 3. And it introduced a whole range of new obligations and things that were called pre-benefit obligations, that requirements that meant that from the time you first made contact with the welfare system, you had to go through this lengthy series of steps before you actually got any benefit. if you didn't make it to the end, well, you never got anything, even if you had in fact been entitled for a period. And there was a much harsher administration and administrative approach and greater use of a wider range of sanctions. And they introduced that actuarial modelling that I mentioned before, the so-called future fiscal liability monitoring. And that was built into the targets. It was the better public service target number one, was reducing the benefit numbers and reducing this number, which all it does is a fancy way of adding up future MSD costs, not wider things. What it didn't do was reform welfare, although they talked endlessly about welfare reform. It didn't actually do that. So what about outcomes? What do we know about the outcomes from what they did do? Given that it's 5 or 6 years old, we actually know very little. There was an evaluation plan, but only bits of it got done, and we never saw any evaluation that attempted to say what has been the overall effect of these welfare reforms. And the data exists. It would have been possible to do that, but they did not do so. One thing we do know is that beneficiary numbers are down, and if that was what the previous government was seeking to do, they were certainly successful in doing that. And in particular, the sole parent support benefit numbers were down. You can see that overall in the 5 years they went down 13.6%, and sole parent support numbers went down 31%, which is, excuse me, a massive drop. That's on the redefined version of sole parent support. So that's children, that's people with children under the age of 14. But movements off the benefit system and into work did not appear to improve at all. So what that graph shows between 2001 and 2015 is the proportion of people who are on a benefit who leave to go into a job. And you can see the big dip is the global financial crisis, not surprising at all. But the period in the early 2000s, which was a similarly strong labour market situation, broadly similar numbers on the welfare system, and we were getting more people moving off benefit into work than we did under this new scheme. Now that's pretty rough and ready in the absence of a proper evaluation, but it's pretty clear that there was no kind of step change in the ability of the new system to shift people into work, which was supposedly a primary aim. And then if you look at broader, more general outcomes, again, they're only indicative and you have to be careful how much you attach to them. What's now called labour force underutilisation, the previous version was joblessness, is still higher than it was before the GFC. This is the wider measure of unemployment and includes people who have given up looking for work and so on, or are not or underemployed. So that suggests that there are more people as a percentage who are wanting work than there used to be. Child poverty, and I'll talk a little bit more about child poverty in a minute, it has been falling, and particularly on the constant value measure, which is the dark blue lines. So that's where you take the child poverty rate and you adjust it only by inflation. The other fainter lines are the 40, 50 and 60% of the current median, in other words, the median for that year. And they show rather less improvement, excuse me, or no improvement at all. I think you have to be a little bit cautious about that one. So if you look at the middle 50% line there, the reddish coloured dots, they didn't actually improve much over the whole 2000s or since the mid-90s, in fact, either. But no overall significant improvement on that front. So just to summarise very quickly about what we do know about what came from the previous government, it clearly reduced current fiscal expenditure because it got a whole lot of people off the benefit. It did not work to improve work and income's effectiveness at helping people into work, and it hasn't coincided with clear improvements in broader social and labour market outcomes. And it was closely linked to a punitive approach to welfare administration that, aside from all the harm that it caused to individuals, undermined trust in work and income. And I think that's one of the serious issues that we face in the future. And an urgent one is rebuilding trust in it. And I'll come back to that in a while when I talk about some of the longer term options. So where do we go from here? Government has quite rightly put its emphasis on child poverty. I'll talk about that in a section. But the point that I want to pick up on was from the speech from the throne, which said, but my government will also go further. That's further than the child poverty and other things. This government will consider the long-term changes which need to occur to our systems of welfare and employment and education to look at how we value people, how we define decent employment, and how we ensure people have sustainable incomes. I think that's crucial. I think it's fantastic. And one of the big risks that the government faces, in my opinion, is that it has committed itself to reducing child poverty by 100,000 by 2020 using the 50% of median measure. That's reducing that number by almost half, by 48%. It's 210,000 now, and they want to get it down by 100,000. And I think there's a risk that it leads it to overload what is already, I've described here as an unseaworthy ship, and will actually make more far-reaching changes more difficult to achieve in the future. So before I turn to the longer term issues, just a few comments about child poverty, and these are just a few very selective points and are only intended to be so. Using that 50% of after housing costs measure, half of all poor children are in two-parent families. More than half, about 56%, are in households where where the main income is from market earnings. And over a third are in households with one or more full-time worker. And they all seem significant, but very few are where there's two full-time workers. And a significant number are actually in their own home with mortgages. In other words, the point I'm trying to make here is that the child poverty rates are extreme amongst families on benefit, and in particular sole parent families. But we have to also remember that there are large numbers of poor people living in two-parent families and in families who are in employment. The other point that I would note is that 210,000 figure, which I believe the Prime Minister was the one the Prime Minister chose as her target, 2/3 of those, so that's the 50% of current median, 2/3 of those are below the 40% of current median. In other words, they're in very severe poverty. They're not close to the borderline. It's going to take a lot to lift those ones up. And that's 140,000 out of the 210,000. So it's not going to be an easy task. Oh, what have I done? Okay, why do I do that? Help! I've now displayed everything and yes. Thank you. It's my reliance on a piece of paper. I don't want to come over as one of those old codgers who bangs on about the past all the time, but careful. No family comments, please. But the point is that for going into a little bit of the history is that our system is still very much based on the 1938 Social Security Act, and it's relevant for now because of that. And that act was very significant and genuinely world-leading. In the context, I couldn't stop myself from putting that bit in brackets about the role of doctors, but we don't need to talk about that. And it was used actually by Beveridge in his report for the UK. I've got a beautiful picture at the end, which I can show you if you like, done by the Public Pictorial Service from 1943 in the UK. And he compares his proposals, the current UK system and the New Zealand system. And that's the comparator that he uses when he was proposing what he was proposing for them. the critical thing about it is it was underpinned by 4 key contexts. It was, first of all, the government's commitment to full employment as a #1 priority, and that lasted right through until the mid-80s. The Industrial Conciliation and Arbitration Act system and the notion of a family wage. Low labour market participation by mothers, and in 1950, the employment rate of women, not just mothers, but all women aged 15 to 64, was 25%. And low sole parenthood rates. Basically, sole parents at that time were mostly widows or what was known as deserted wives, and numbers were low. None of those holds today. All of those have changed. And part of my argument is that the system has not changed adequately to deal with that. We've had 3 substantial changes since. ACC, which is a universal coverage and individual entitlement social insurance for accidental injury, and is a fantastic success in my view. The domestic purposes benefit in 1974, which was a major breakthrough at the time, but it was a bolt-on to the existing notion of the male breadwinner. It was an attempt to retain the male breadwinner concept and have this add-on system. It was a breakthrough, and it helped many, nearly all of them were women, mostly women, but it hasn't prevented sole parent family poverty, and it's got a bunch of other problems as well, which I'll talk about in a bit later. And the third one was the shift, the introduction of family tax credits from about 1985 on, which was a shift from universal to targeted support for children. And that was different. That was ideologically driven. That was the state's role being pushed back into the idea of helping only those with the greatest need. And it was also a response to the unwinding of the wage setting system. It was also a response to the introduction of GST. The first part of it was when it was first introduced. But it was a response to the changes in the wage setting system, and in particular, an attempt at a least cost way of dealing with the least acceptable aspect of the shift from the family wage and award wage setting to a predominantly individualised wage bargaining. At the same time, what was going on among the population was, and everyone knows this, and none of this is new. Women's employment and labour force participation had risen in a way that was transformational. So I mentioned that 25% in 1950. It's now 71% for that group. And the single income couple with children household, which was the norm for the system, is now a minority. In most couple families, both parents work, and even when the children are young, wrong button, even when the children are young. So this is off the census 2013. It's by the age of the youngest child, 0 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, and 15 to 7. The blue are where there's 2 full-time workers. The next one, the orangey coloured, brownie coloured, is 1 full-time and 1 part-time worker. The grey is the old-fashioned one full-time worker, and the others are 2 part-time, 1 part-time, or not employed. And you can see that even for under 5s, for 0 to 4, the number which are 1.5 or 2 full-time workers is as much as the 1 full-time worker household. By the time you get to the first half of primary school age for the youngest, the 1.5 and 2 full-time has risen up to about 65%, something of that sort, and the 1 full-time earner is down to 20 odd, and that shrinks even further. And as the youngest child gets older, until by the time that they are teenagers of 15. You've got half 2 full-time workers, and another 20-something% are 1.5 time workers. So that's a completely different pattern of work amongst coupled households with children than we had originally designed the system for. And partly it's driven through women wanting careers and so on. But in a lot of cases, it's because they both need to work. And one illustration of that is the living wage. The living wage is based on an assumption of 60 hours work in the family, 1.5 jobs, and it includes all the add-ons, working for families, tax credits and so on, and its current value is set at $20.20. Well, the male median wage at the moment, half of all male employees get less than 25, and half of all female employees get less than 23. In other words, if you were to try and get even a living wage family income, which is regarded as the lowest satisfactory income, with just one earner, you're going to have a wage rate for that earner that's well and truly above the median. You can't just say 1.5 because there would be some adjustments to the working for families credits, but it's going to be well above the median. So most people are going to have more than that in order to get to just the living wage. And if one of them loses their job because of ill health, redundancy or whatever, they're not going to be entitled to any benefit at all if the partner earns above 622 a week, which is about 40 hours at the minimum wage. Your benefit is completely abated to zero and you've got no entitlement. If the partner earns over $100 a week, then it begins to abate. So you'll only get a partial benefit. And that's one of the core problems, I think, as far as families go. You cannot get by on one income unless you are able to command a decent wage. And if you don't, if you lose one job or only have the capacity for one person to work, our system does not allow you any compensation unless it's a very, very low wage. This is also old news. Living arrangements have changed and are now more varied and dynamic. We have a high rate of sole parenthood, 23% compared to the OECD average of around 15. 1 in 5 children are part of the child support system, and a whole lot have separated parents, but they're in the informal system. The average payment on child support, by the way, is less than 40. And of course, if you're on a benefit, you don't get it at all. And some work that was done using the second generation study in Dunedin suggests that it's only a small sample and they're the younger ones of the second generation, but it suggests that less than half of the children born into a two-parent family will stay in that family, stay with those two parents until age 16. And the thing that came through that paper by Sligo et al. Was the level of change that went on in most families. So the point that I want to make out of that is living arrangements are not, it was clearer in the old days. You were either married or you were a widow or single or whatever. It was much more binary and much more easily defined. It's not the case anymore, and that's where we get all of the problems with the relationship status test and the welfare system and applying it. And if you want detail on that, there's a Child Poverty Action Group paper that came out earlier this year that is excellent. And then on top of that, shifting off the benefit into full-time work is also difficult if you're a low-earning sole parent. If you are earning around the living wage or less, $20, if that's the wage that you can command, $20 or less, the additional gain from going from part-time work and on a benefit into full-time work is not very much. And if there's additional childcare costs or work-related costs associated with it, it's probably not going to be worth it for a lot of people. So for many of those low-paid sole parents, it's typically going to be better to stay on the benefit if they can, and earn $100 to $200, $200 where the full-time, where the high rate of abatement cuts in. And the third part of that is repartnering for sole parent benefits. The way our system is set up at the moment makes that difficult. we assume, and this, this isn't new either, everyone knows this, the welfare system, the working for families system assumes that the new partner or the new couple, or the new partner will take financial responsibility for a sole parent and his or her children if they become a couple. That's after child support, which is often low, and after working for families. And that may not be appropriate. It may not be how they want to share costs in a new family. It can create a new form of dependency. And if the new partner is employed, it typically represents a very large fall in his or her income, because they're going to be going from a single person with that income to a responsibility, a financial responsibility assumed by the state for those other people. So, summarising it, for many low earners on sole parent benefit, the way the incentives are set up is to adjust to a low living standard with, if you can, some supplementary part-time earnings, and to be very careful about the boyfriends, the relationships, because that risks getting you into problems. And they, I'm sure, difficult to prove the extent to which they are factors, but they are almost certainly factors in our high rate of sole parenthood, the high proportion of sole parents that are on benefit, and the rates of benefit we pay contribute to their high rate of poverty. Then the last point I want to make about the way things have changed is the future of work stuff. And I don't buy the doomsday stuff about 47% of all jobs are going to disappear, and what are we all going to do, etc. But there will be large-scale structural labour market change, and that implies structural unemployment. It implies the need for retraining, better income support, a whole transitioning program that is not yet developed, and which the CTU I know has been talking about. And again, for couples who need two incomes to get by on, or for sole parents, that under our current settings spells trouble. If you are one of the people who gets laid off, and it's a long, slow process before you transition into another occupation or industry, but we've got a system that doesn't provide you with income maintenance because you've got a partner, that's going to be a problem. And the other thing that's worth noting about the future of work, and it's not often talked about in that context, is there will still be business cycles, and we need to make sure that our system is set up in terms of both welfare and active labour market programs to deal properly with slowdowns, cyclical unemployment caused by economic slowdowns. So to summarise, just before I go on, I'm going to take up too much time. In fact, I'll skip the summarising and go straight on in that case, because summarising is just repeating itself. So what are the options? I couldn't resist saying that bit at the top, that this was the same things that were faced by the Welfare Working Group, but of course that was not their agenda, and that's politics, I guess. What I want to talk mostly is around shifting more of our entitlements to an individual-based assessment rather than couple-based, because that's the one that you will have gathered I see as a really significant problem. But before I did that, I want to talk a bit about whether any of those other three mentioned there could do the job, or how useful. How far could we go if we were enhancing the status quo, the current policy framework, and adding in Best Start and expanded PPL and so on? I think that it could potentially deal with some of the serious aspects of poverty short term. You can pump up the programs to provide more money to people, but that's likely to worsen EMTR, effective marginal tax rate problems. And if you think about that in simple terms, if we use those programs to make up for loss when one person loses their job, by definition, when one person gains their job, that person gains a job, it gets taken back off them through loss of those things. You can't have it both ways, and that's the effect of marginal tax problem. I don't think that it can protect the sort of couple situation that I was talking about unless it had very high rates and EMTRs. It can't deal with the relationship status issues, and it's not consistent with the dynamics and complexities of current family relationships. So goodwill and increasing spending can help, and I say spending, not investment, but we'll talk about that if people want to ask about the meaning of social investment. It's spending to help income support. It's not investment. Sometimes it's investment, but often this is just income support, and so it should be. What about the UBI? And I'm not a fan of the UBI. It's attractive in its simplicity, and there have been some good discussions of it in New Zealand, and most notably Keith Rankin's, and there have been some really bad ones, and most notably Gareth Morgan and Susan Guthrie's. And a lot of it in New Zealand has been driven partly by that future of work and the precarity and precarious working issues, that Guy Standing has been talking about, but also by the disenchantment with the way our welfare system has been deliberately operated. And it's that thing that you hear from a lot of well-meaning progressive sorts: why can't we just get rid of WINS entirely? And the problem with getting rid of WINS is that the rate would have to be implausibly high. There's another problem, is that I don't think we should get rid of WINS. I think a public employment and income support service is an excellent thing to have, but the rate would have to be implausibly high. You could maybe do it for couples, because you'd have 2 UBIs and the child UBIs. Doing it for sole parents is much, much harder, because you've only got 1 UBI and the child UBIs. And as an example of that, the 50% poverty line that we've been talking about, the Prime Minister's talking about, for a sole parent with 2 children is 33,300 per annum. So you've got to have UBIs that can get you up to that much just for that family to be on the boundary line of 50% poverty. Or some people talk about having a partial UBI, which is then topped up with, where needed, with additional payments that are income tested and relationship status tested, in which case you're back to square one. I don't see that you've made any great gain. Universal income support has obviously got its place, and the obvious one is amongst retired people and for those with young children, or the young children themselves, but not as a sort of panacea that will solve all problems. I am a bit more tempted by whether we should be thinking more about social insurance in the European style, at least in some areas. It's got some advantages. It's more generous. It's an individualised entitlement. It has got no reference to your partner, same as our ACC. The disadvantage is that not everyone qualifies. If you don't have the work history, you're not going to be able to get it. So that's going to mean that it's more likely that groups like women with non-inconsistent work histories, precariously employed and so on, are going to miss out. And if precarity and so on is growing, it's going to be less and less effective. Doesn't help sole parents who are still reliant on the second tier. And whether you regard it as a disadvantage or not, it is regressive in the sense that it's designed to insure against income loss, and therefore if your income is higher, you get more. I think, and I'll come back to this, the idea that the CTU and also the OECD suggested that we have a payroll-funded, relatively short national redundancy payment, maybe 8-12 weeks or something, I'm not sure, which can be thought of as like a short-term social insurance redundancy-focused program, does have some beneficial option. I'm running out of time, and I haven't even got to what I want to talk about. Sorry, I'll be really, really quick. Okay, so where I think we need to look at is around individual-based entitlement, and you could do it fully. If you did it fully, it would mean that you would have only a single rate of benefit, no couple rates, no sole parent rates. Your accommodation supplement would depend on the people you lived in the house with, not your relationship to them. And if you had work testing, it would apply to you, not to others. You could do these parts separately, and you can think of them as in the same direction. So one that I would really strongly argue in favour of is extending ACC to people with disabilities and long-term sickness. They face the same problem. If you are sick and you have a working partner, you do not get entitlement because it's joint income testing. And it was always Woodhouse's view that it should be extended. At the Policy Observatory at AUT, we got a very rough costing done, which suggests you could shift the SBIBs at a gross rate of about 20,000 per person, and then take off the benefit things, so it'll be lost. But there are all those other people who would be entitled who, in addition to that. And you could have that redundancy payment I was talking about. What about full individualisation of the welfare system? The advantages are that it gives a married partner person the same entitlements as everyone else. It's consistent with the labour market behaviour. It minimises assumptions about how income and costs are shared. And we know that they're not shared, they're not always shared equally within couples. And it doesn't make assumptions that non-couples don't share. And it allows changing relationships more to be accommodated more easily. The criticisms that have come up about it, if you believe that work testing of carers is wrong, well, this is not a flyer, because work testing is a necessary part of what I'm talking about. The other criticisms that have come up are the ladies who lunch, we'd be giving benefits to rich people, or people whose spouse had a high income. Only if they're willing to be work tested. I don't think that's a major problem. There would be, even if it was kind work testing, there would be additional expenditure going to couple families, and that's kind of part of the point, to my way of thinking. And then there's the issue about the carers of a child under 3, and therefore they wouldn't be work tested. That's also part of the point. It's extending support to someone with caring for a child under 3. And it's loosening up on that targeting, which has been part of the problem. Cost is definitely a problem, but it may not be as bad as all that. And in fact, some parts of it can be dealt with. So, for example, a proportion of those who have a child under 3 are going to want to go back to work anyway, for their own reasons and because it's financially worthwhile. If you were getting one, if you were getting PPL, you wouldn't get the other. And if you wanted to go further, this could actually replace PPL, which is a more equitable way of doing it, because it would be a flat rate rather than a higher income related rate. And you have to remember that the Best Start proposal is a step in the same direction. The other two ideas are extending ACC and the redundancy suggestion. They can actually be thought of as justified in their own right anyway. So, just conclusions. What I'm trying to argue is that effective welfare and social protection has to fit with the way the labour market is and the way we earn our living, and it has to fit with the way we live our lives. We've sought to adapt our system to meet those changing labour market arrangements and living arrangements, and we've done so mainly by adding additional complexity on, and by that process of tightening of targeting. Increased generosity of payments and relaxing the targeting can go some way, but it can't address that basic need to modernise the structure of it, and it may in fact make it more difficult to go through that process. The suggestions that I've made are certainly not the only ways you could go. And the last point I'd end with is, we choose these welfare structures and we choose their outcomes, and they reflect values, they reflect collective social values. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael.
I cleverly left you no time to ask questions.
It's, thank you for your optimism and your thoughts about how we might fix what is clearly a not fit for purpose social welfare system and deal with poverty as a determinant of health. We've got time for a few questions, and I think
Thank you very much, Michael. That was a very thoughtful presentation that I very much agree with. The one point about the difference between the 1938 Act and the situation we're currently in, which you didn't mention, I think, is the expectation that you had stability in housing. You either owned your own house, and of course this is a problem now as people coming to superannuation, retiring without owning a house, or that you had stability in the rental housing. And that's one of the main reasons state housing was set up. So I think, while I agree with all your rationale and largely your conclusions, that's the major policy problem, I think, at the moment, because so many of these children in poverty are in rental housing and churning through one bad apartment or flat up the other.
I think, that adds to the argument rather than, no, I agree.
Kia ora, Michael. I wonder if you can talk a bit more about WINS. When I was applying recently for my pension, I compared my experiences with applying for the domestic purposes benefit in the 1990s, and I must say I was treated much better in the more recent experience. What can we do to make WINS more helpful?
I don't think. The most dreadful story that I've heard recently was someone who's on supported living payment because they're looking after a 91-year-old mother with dementia and had failed to attend an appointment on time, so the benefit was cut off. And she was required to go and get a new medical certificate for the 91-year-old in case her dementia had got better. But I don't actually think that there is any reason why those services cannot be delivered in a way that works. I don't think there's anything fundamentally. I know some people say, well, if you're going to give out money from, if the state's going to be giving out money, then it's going to be difficult. I had contact with ACC recently, and they were fantastic. I was lying in bed groaning, and the woman rang me up and said, "We've started your payments." It's not. It doesn't have to be that way.
Kia ora, thanks for the great presentation. I'm Maurice Priestley. I was particularly impressed that you've included the ACC situation and the discrepancy between accident causation and people who have congenital or disease or illness as a precursor to their disability. And I think that is particularly important for parents of young children with disabilities and the impact on that, on their viability and their poverty and their ability to cope with life. And that's particularly, and I note that when ACC was first mooted by Woodhouse, etc., that it was actually designed to be a universal system. So, but and I've had various discussions with people at different levels about this, and people have always that I've always been kind of, the discussion was that we just don't have the political motivation to go that far. And I just wonder what you're feeling about that is at the moment.
Yeah. If I recall correctly, we went towards that at one point. I can't remember the dates. But a colleague of mine, or a friend in Auckland, Grant Duncan, who works at Massey, who's done a lot of work on ACC, he pointed out to me that whether we liked it at the time or not, the fact that it's shifted to full funding and there's now this huge pot of money in ACC actually makes it far more feasible to shift to including sickness, long-term sickness and disability. If I was choosing these things, that would be the first one I would choose. Yeah.
We've got time for one more question.
Hi, thanks, Michael, for that great talk. Just a question: if we've got a major preoccupation with reducing child poverty, which seems very desirable, will that produce a different pattern of reform from what we might get otherwise? If that's the single most important priority of the government at present.
I know the government is going to be making some announcements in a few days, and I have no idea what they are. What worries me is that they've set themselves a large target on a short time period, and you'd have to think that the advice they'd be getting is pump money into this, whatever, and actually it's going to make all of the lopsided bits even more lopsided. So I'm all in favour of giving people more money, but in terms of that, I think there is a risk that it would create a different set of outcomes, yeah, and be harder to unwind.
Thank you very much, Michael. We've run out of time, I think. But thank you all for coming, and thank you again for a great, really interesting talk, and for extending ourselves a bit into the social determinants of health, which is great. And I hope that Michael will be around for a little bit afterwards if people have got more questions and want to have more discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you.